Welcome back, Jeff. How are you today?
Jose, it has been a while. It is good to talk to you.
Yeah, last time we were talking about sports and, well, rather fitting because the past week we just saw political blood sports go down. And yeah, just wanted to get your overall thoughts on Trump's pretty epic comeback if you think about it, because he was dealing with all that lawfare litigation and then failed assassination attempt. Then he pulled the Grover Cleveland and won a second non-consecutive election as president. So what are your general thoughts there?
It's pretty remarkable. I would argue that this is a bigger deal than 2016. 2016 was an earthquake. Don't get me wrong. I remember distinctly that night watching TV with my wife and sort of staring at each other as it got to be 8, 9, 10, 11 o'clock. Because like so many other people, we were just absolutely shocked and had assumed that Hillary would win. And there was a lot to not like about Hillary. But what we didn't quite grasp was the degree of unhappiness in the country that would allow 70-some million people to go off script and not vote for the progressive, inevitable candidate. Hillary Clinton was destined to be the first female president. So that was pretty shocking. But I would say this time, we had 4 years of Trump. We've seen what he is. We know what he is. We've really been watching him now for about 9 years in the political sense, since late 2015. And so for him to come back is pretty remarkable. But the sub-story here, the subplot, of course, is that Joe Biden engineered this out of vindictiveness when he had that bad debate performance and the drumbeat really started growing for him to drop out of the race. And people like George Clooney and Nancy Pelosi were involved in that. People were really pressuring him. And even today, Biden and his wife Jill resent that deeply. And so I think that was why within a few hours of his public decision to step down, he turned around and endorsed Kamala Harris when Pelosi and company had in mind a truncated but nonetheless primary process, which would have elevated some Gavin Newsom, whoever it might have been, perhaps one of the wretched female Democratic governors like Whitmer. And so Biden did that to them so quickly. I think that Kamala was a lost cause. But again, nonetheless, it's not really about Kamala or the Democrats. It's about those 70-some million Americans who are willing to go off script and vote for this guy again. And we'll have to see if he's learned any lessons from his first term. There's a book by Bob Woodward, the famous Woodward and Bernstein duo from Watergate. No fan of Trump, but it's called Fear. And it's about Trump's first go-around in his cabinet, and many of his own advisors, cabinet members, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Pentagon officials, his own vice president, his own Secretary of State actively working to undermine him. There are serious parallels to JFK, which Bernstein draws in that book. And we'll just have to see if this time around Trump does the same thing. We're finding out every day now some of his new cabinet choices. They won't all get confirmed, presumably, but we have to be optimistic here, Jose. There's no other choice. This guy, for all of us who come from sort of a Rothbardian and anti-state background, I think Pat Buchanan's somewhat vindicated. I think Ron Paul's somewhat vindicated. And I think it's a beautiful thing.
Yes, I am. I think that the silver lining here about Trump is, regardless, I have my misgivings about him and just in general, the populist movement. But one thing that's undeniable, in my opinion, is that he has thoroughly discredited the liberal international order and is about to put final nail in the coffin in it, because I just look at both of his elections as really the final acts of the institutional unraveling of the U.S. empire in many respects, because he's already put down the Bush dynasty, the Clinton dynasty, and has even discredited a good deal of the Republican Party as previously conceived, the Reaganite, Bushite type of conventional wisdom. And for that, I think that there is a silver lining there. But going back to like more about the backdrop of this election, what do you think propelled Trump's victory at the second time around? Do you buy the narrative about it's the economy stupid? Or do you think that there is still that underlying resentment, that pent up resentment that came about in response to the so-called Great Awakening of 2014?
Well, I have to think it's both. No doubt about it. We were told that abortion and women were going to win this election for Kamala. And let's not forget, there was the compromise on abortion, and it was the correct compromise, which is to undo Roe v. Wade, which made up a federal right, constitutional right to abortion out of thin air, and return it properly to the states. So that's the compromise. You live in a state, and if you really don't like it that much, and you really want your college daughter to be able to have 5 abortions, then go move to some blue state, right? I mean, that is the compromise. Abortion should not even have been an issue, but the left has to have that. It has to have women. And this time around, we found that a lot of women, especially married women, didn't vote that way. So I think that's important to understand that there was, perhaps more of the economy as a factor. But the end of wokeism, that's probably overstated, but it is important that a lot of people are starting to push back. And we are seeing what the left probably truly fears and ought to fear, and which is creating, and very reluctantly, I would say, on the part of average dopey white suburbanites, a white political consciousness. At some point, you tell people they're the devil long enough, and they start to either believe it, which is progressive white leftists, or rebel, which is Trump white folks, right? So that's a very interesting, I think, element of this. So I would say it was a blend of the economy and the social issues. I mean, people really have had it. And the left in this country is particularly evil. It's far worse than the right. I mean, for all of the dopiness of Republicans. And as you mentioned earlier, when he really took out a lot of the old Reaganite GOP, let's just be frank, that's a beautiful thing. That's a good thing.
Categorically.
Right. And so there's a lot at work here. The big mystery is those missing 20 million votes that Biden allegedly got last time that Kamala didn't get this time. Where are those 20 million people? Well, I suspect they are buried all across this country in the form of fake voter rolls. I don't think they ever existed. So the 2020 election now looks even more fishy.
Oh, big time. Yeah, that was an installation, if you will. I think you were one of the people that put that term in the political lexicon and after the fallout of 2020 when you said that Biden was installed. Yeah, like that is a good way of looking at it. And yes, that does lend credence to a lot of foul play that took place in 2020. I want to ask you this as well, because one thing to point of conventional wisdom that I've been hammering home since I got into politics with regards to Hispanic voters, and I've been saying this since time immemorial, is that they do not care about mass migration, like open border stuff. I've even argued that there's a pretty big constituency with that demographic that is actually in favor of immigration restriction. Just look at the legacy of Cesar Chavez. And this election, actually these 3 past elections, there was this narrative that, if a Republican runs on a unapologetic immigration restriction platform, you will lose like the Hispanic vote. It will go like the way that's like blacks vote for Democrats. That has been refuted 3 times. In fact, Trump has built his lead with the Hispanic vote from 2016 up until 2020. Do you see this as a Hispanics rejecting the civil rights revolution consensus, the Rainbow Coalition narrative that has been built by the progressive left?
Yes, absolutely. And it's also a nice instance where we have some proof that people don't really like pandering. Remember Jeb with his 2 exclamation points?
Awful.
You're right. And it's like the Republican Party goes all this. So the Reaganite wing has spent the last 25 years saying, oh, Hispanics are natural conservatives. They're Catholic. They're pro-family. They're not necessarily thrilled with abortion, et cetera, et cetera. It never worked, never worked, never worked. And then Trump comes along. And let's face it, Trump is a masculine figure. Jeb Bush is a feminine figure.
Yeah.
And so just among Hispanic males, I think, right? And, anyone who's spent a lot of time in, places like Southern California knows that the Southern California is more Mexican. Where I live now in Alabama is more of a mix of Central South American. But anyone who's been in these communities understands that the long timers aren't thrilled about the illegals. It's just a fact of life. And it was just nice to see that this pandering isn't working. The other thing is that our pollsters and our political class and our talking heads are dishonest to a fault. They don't like to talk about unpleasant truths. And one of those unpleasant truths is there's a serious rift in this country between Hispanics and blacks.
When you mentioned Southern California, not to interrupt, but when you mentioned Southern California, I just thought like ethnic cleansing of Compton because it's like now mostly Hispanic.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes. I mean, the Crips and the Bloods have been totally driven out of those South Central neighborhoods by more numerous and better organized Hispanic gangs. So there's always been this tension. And there was a time, it wasn't that long ago, let's say 50 years ago, America was basically, not entirely, but basically about 90 white, 10 black. And so that blacks were the favored minority constituency. They were the victim group. They were the target of the entire civil rights movement. It was to benefit them. Repealing Jim Crow, the entire Great Society welfare programs under LBJ were basically designed to help black folks. And so black folks had a lot of problems and they had a lot of anger and they had a lot of bones to pick, but they were it. And now you fast forward 50 years, and because black leaders sold out and got on board with open borders, now you're going to have a country where blacks are still roughly 10, 12%, but you've got tons of Asians, you've got tons of Indians, you've got tons of Hispanics from various parts of Central South America and Mexico. And all those various groups are not nearly as interested in the black trouble, black issues as dopey progressive whites.
This election vindicated a book that was written 20 years ago that is titled The Presumed Alliance, the Unspoken Conflict Between Latinos and Blacks and What It Means for America. This was written by this one Hispanic PhD guy, Nicolas Vaca, but I've read it and it was absolutely prescient. And I would add that I think the Trayvon Martin incident was probably one of the first catalysts for this because in that case, George Zimmerman, people forget this, he's part Peruvian, but he was branded by the media as white. And I think that served as a wake-up call to a lot of people and a lot of Hispanics in the U.S. that in this new frame of Negro-centric political analysis that goes back to the 1619 Project, you're going to be treated as white. And I think a good deal of them have started to identify more with the nation-building Western European stock of the country more so than the blacks. Because the one thing that is peculiar about wokeism compared to, say, like the 1990s style rainbow coalition is wokeism is quite literally black and white. Well, black versus white. You go back to 1619 and or even the civil rights revolution. No Hispanic is going to really identify that much with that struggle whatsoever. In fact, if you go back to 1619, they're probably going to identify more with their conquistador ancestors, if we're being brutally honest. And there are what I would call foundational Hispanic Americans in the U.S. that still inhabit parts of the Southwest who are like the ancestors of conquistadors who settled that area. So it is very interesting how a lot of paradigms are collapsing before our very eyes. And one paradigm as well that I think is collapsing too, and we were talking about this before our recording. When we look at U.S. history in the past century, we see the crystallization of like the New Deal, the Great Society, and even to a lesser extent, the Obama coalition, where you saw Democrats dominate with trifectas that were either super majority or damn near close to super majority. And there was landmark legislation passed, whether it's Social Security, the civil rights, Medicare, Medicaid, or Obamacare to a lesser extent. But it seems now we're seeing not only like the presidency switch hands every election cycle, but even when like a party comes into power, whether it's the Democrats in 2020 or Republicans in 2024, they don't have like that resounding of like a majority that to build like a filibuster proof majority, have like a super majority to pass legislation easily without the other party obstructing, or even a dissident faction within that same party obstructing. What do you make of that? Is that a testament of the level of polarization in the US that prevents this type of consensus from ever forming?
Well, absolutely. We are not the same country. I mean, the country that absolutely unified to fight World War II, the country that cheered even the moon landing, that country's long gone. When even the country that all watched Monday Night Football or Walter Cronkite on the news, or Johnny Carson, all those sort of unifying factors that cut across political lines, those are gone. I mean, now people view politics, especially at the national level, as some sort of blood sport, an existential defeat when Trump wins. And so the left now feels like they live in an occupied country with a hostile occupying government, right? And so that's absurd and silly, but it is the way it is. And so the happy result of that is that maybe we won't have these grandiose, sweeping legislative great leaps forward. We won't have...
Yes, another silver lining.
Right. We won't have Green New Deal. We won't have consensus to at least, and that every 2 years, maybe the House will sort of change within administrations, and we won't have consensus for these great leaps forward. And of course, that's what we want. We don't want grandiose government. We just don't want the apparatus of government working against us. I mean, that's for sure. So it is true, but it's also international. It's not just domestic. On the international scene, I think the world is starting to understand what Trump understood instinctively, despite we need the adults in the room, all these,
my God.
Right. Like these lifelong State Department people who really understand real politics. Well, it turns out Trump understands real politics a lot better than they do when it comes to Putin, when it comes to North Korea, when it comes to China and Taiwan, when it comes to Ukraine. And so this idea that came about and really was placed on steroids after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall was American hegemony, this Francis Fukuyama end of history stuff, and that we were going to be the unipolar neoliberal leading light of the world, and we were going to impose our way on everybody. And let's not forget that there was a neoconservative wing of the Republicans who boosted that. There was a terrible neoliberal wing of the left. And the awful libertarians did this as well. This sort of universalist doctrine, social democracy. Yeah, we're gonna be socially liberal and fiscally conservative across the whole world, and that means basically at least grudging respect for property rights and capitalism, but only because they produce the best results materially, so that we can get to what really interests us, which is women's rights, gay marriage, LGBT, climate, racism, anti-sexism, all that kind of stuff. So that was just assumed by everyone to be good and correct, and that was the way it was going to be. And so now there's a myriad of ways, from the BRIC idea to the Russia-Ukraine war, to the economic problems that Germany's facing, which used to be the absolute economic king and engine of the EU. I mean, there's so many ways that we can see this unipolar world is breaking down. And I think maybe even COVID accelerated that a little bit. So this is a time when we need Trump, we need the Tulsis, we need the Douglas McGregors to come in and say, look, it is a changed world. We can't have this far-flung military empire. We can't enter wars of convenience, nation building to try to create Jeffersonian ideals in Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever. We have to deal with Putin as he is. We have to understand that China is not going away. We cannot have World War III over Taiwan. And Iran is not Iraq. Iran is a real country with a real military and a real air force. And we can't just let World War III happen because Israel wants it either. So it's a new day, Jose.
I want to touch on Fukuyama because that's another paradigm that was completely shattered. And I do think that all listeners to the show should actually try to read his work because it is just to understand what the psyche of the ruling class has been for the past few decades. And he's now just pretty much dooming about the system. It's just hilarious. But what was, based on your reading of his work, what was the central premise of his arguments in the 90s? And what does it look like now after a math of the Trump victories?
Well, the interesting point about Fukuyama's book is he was in his heyday about the same time as Arthur Bloom's Closing of the American Mind. Those two books were both a big deal back then. And now with social media, the pace of information and news has accelerated so quickly that no book or article can have the same staying power as they used to have. It used to be a time where an article might come out and people would talk about it for a month or two. It'd be a big deal. And a book would almost set the tone for an entire year of political debate. And those days are gone because the news cycle and the social media cycle, the amount of white noise coming at us. I mean, Fukuyama's idea that it was so inherently transgressive. It was so inherently left wing. It was like the Whig theory that there is this idea that there's an arc to history. It's progressive. It only goes one way. And that human beings can reach sort of their full and final expression politically in this neoliberal social democracy. And that inevitably needs to spread around the world. We can't have the Saudi Arabias of the world covering their women and stoning people for adultery or whatever the image might be. And that we've eradicated through sort of technocratic governments. We're going to eradicate things like Great Depressions and stock market crashes and even public health crises. And we're going to eradicate wars. The hubris of that. I mean, everything in human nature tells us that
strong gods.
Humans revert to type and history is cyclical. And so when you come along and say, well, I'm Francis Fukuyama and the cycle is coming to an end. And the worst thing about it all is that these people, they never go away. They never retire. They continue to command big salaries, get invited onto TV and everything. And so many of these boomers like Charles Murray and Fukuyama are still plaguing us and drawing huge salaries and resting on their laurels. And we got to sweep them away. They got to go.
Mm. You know, another figure that I think just got completely wrecked is, what was his name? The whole world is black guy, Thomas Friedman. Yeah, that whole globalization, fetishization by the elites. That's been taking an L. Actually, the funny part is things have been deglobalizing even under the moribund Biden regime as well. Some of these forces are so strong, this breakdown of the international system is so strong that it's no longer it's no longer a partisan thing. I think there's a growing consensus, no matter how hard some Democrats will talk about the rules-based international order or free trade and all this nonsense, that we're seeing a systemic collapse of the present global trade arrangement. Just look at the Houthis shutting down the Red Sea, or the U.S. just in a ham-fisted way doing that whole CHIPS Act, trying to bring semiconductors and all chip processing the US, or like friend shoring and near shoring with extensive allies as opposed to like sourcing stuff from China. It seems that we're seeing that we are witnessing a total breakdown of the current trade ecosystem. And where do you see this going forward, Jeff? Do you see like a return to like a more protectionist order, or a move towards more realistic, like bilateral trade agreements between nations as opposed to these just really convoluted trade structures like NAFTA?
Well, I think we're heading back towards regionalism and mercantilism. I think we're going to have trading blocks. I think it is not in the interests of the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and maybe the Indians to just accept Uncle Sam's edicts on everything, war, foreign policy, the dollar, et cetera. So I think you're going to see Europe struggling and having to find new trading partners. The U.S. has learned some lessons. Look, COVID showed that free trade can break down pretty quickly. The Schengen area closed all of its borders over a flu virus that was only slightly more lethal to especially elderly and fatties than standard flu variations. And that's all it took was a 10% more lethal flu virus, and the entire Schengen area agreement just collapsed. No, you can't drive between Germany and France anymore. So that was interesting. And I heard people point out there's a global libertarian free trade argument that specialization, comparative advantage means that the entire world as a whole gets wealthier with complete free trade. The flip side of that, of course, is that we have found out that virtually all of our new cars now require chips, semiconductors of some kind, and there's a complete bottleneck. They almost all come from Taiwan. Well, why should that be? Why should it be that we can't chemically make aspirin? We don't have aspirin factory capabilities in the United States anymore. I mean, these are questions that go beyond just, and I think even Mises and Rothbard would agree that these are questions that go beyond simply the pure economics when there are political machinations involved. And I remember distinctly Pat Buchanan saying back after the Japanese tsunami, which caused the nuclear power plant problems. After that Japanese tsunami, it was the day after Christmas. It was Boxing Day. I want to say 2011. Please don't quote me. And as a result of that, for the next 6 to 12 months, Honda dealerships in America, for example, had far fewer inventory and were struggling for parts for their service departments. And Pat Buchanan, who's a populist trade protectionist, pointed out, like, look, this is what just-in-time delivery means. It means that when there's a tsunami, Honda dealerships in America don't function correctly. And he had a point. I mean, you can talk about autarky and this idea that it's silly for a wealthy nation to want to produce everything domestically. And I think that's true largely. But the pure Lulbert idea that NAFTA and GATT and all these things were just wonderful for America, well, that just isn't true.
No. If anything, NAFTA, in my opinion, you gotta you're stuck on level one and you just see this as the flow of goods, services, people, capital, blah, 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 all that fluffy talk. To me, this is a political machination to create like a North American Union. It's like the first step. That's really what the play was with that. And my fear is that they may actually try to resurrect something like this now that things are becoming more regional. I think that there's probably going to be, because these parasites in DC, they'll probably realize, oh, we can't really do this kind of stuff like on like a transnational, well, at least like a trans-hemispheric basis and go across the pond and try this. But hey, we'll try to reconsolidate and try to do this like in Latin America or whatever, that's within our immediate backyard, and then try to like revitalize that. But that in of itself is going to be a challenge, because I do think the U.S. empire, frankly, is not in its like best shape. And I think economically speaking, there's some major headwinds. And you, Jeff, said that you're optimistic about Trump. Now, as far as the economic front, do you think that Trump has the chance of potentially rolling back the administrative state and taming inflation and putting the country back on a much more stable economic footing, both fiscally and in terms of just unshackling the country of like this regulatory state has burned it in it for the past century?
Well, it's tough that, government spending is at the core of all of our economic problems. In other words, everything flows from that. Federal government spends too much. That means it does too much on the regulatory side. That means it does too much on the military side. That means it does too much on the entitlement side. And so politically, it's very hard to get anyone to agree to cut so-called defense spending. And it's even harder to get any cuts in entitlement spending, especially Social Security and Medicare. And so those three items alone, defense, Social Security, and Medicare, are such a huge part of our budget that are basically politically untouchable. That, it's nice when Elon and Vivek come out and say, well, we're going to have a commission. And we're going to point out every time there's this waste of taxpayer dollars on some stupid study. We're studying the mating habits of frogs somewhere. So, and it costs $40 million. That's good for a laugh. And we can all agree that ought to go away. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is military adventurism and welfare for old people. So until you can tackle this politically, I'm afraid there's not a lot he can do about inflation because it's baked into the cake. In other words, he's inheriting an economy where, partially his own fault and partially Biden's fault, there was such reckless COVID spending. Let's not forget. And that wasn't through the Fed creating money or creating credit in a roundabout way by buying assets and putting that money into commercial bank reserves. This was just direct fiscal money creation to the tune of $6 trillion between the end of the Trump administration and the beginning of the Biden administration. So I don't know. I'm not smart enough, or it's above my pay grade to say how Trump fixes that because the spending cuts are too politically painful, I think, to be palatable. So I'm less optimistic there. But on the administrative front, I am optimistic that if he continues appointing what are viewed as radicals to these cabinet positions, that maybe we'll have some natural attrition, especially amongst the boomers that clog up our administrative agencies. The lifers, they all need to go home. And hell, a lot of them never came back from COVID, so they're already home. Just stop paying them. And so I think there's an opportunity there to say, hey, look, this really is out of control, this administrative bloat. And who knows? I think the reason we have to be optimistic is because 10 years ago, Trump wouldn't have been possible. That you couldn't have written this as a play or as a screenplay, I should say. And yet it happened. So the idea that 10 years from now, maybe American military adventurism could really be severely curtailed by events. So I thought that we were just going to slide into a Hillary Clinton neoliberal morass, and that was just going to be the way the country went. And it didn't go that way. And so I think we have to be courageous enough to say anything's possible.
So I've been in the political space for like close to 2 decades, and I've seen all the petty factional infighting within the GOP, whether it's like the neocon factions, the Reaganite factions, or like Chamber of Commerce factions, trash the great Dr. Ron Paul and like derail him and many of his allies in Congress or in like a myriad of other races. Do you think that in this era of Trump that those people, this like consortium of establishment actors are going to get just completely curb stomped and stiff-armed, or will there be a proverbial Republican kind of like civil war, if you will, once Trump leaves? Well, once Trump exits his presidential term because of his obvious term limits?
Well, the Borg, the DC blob, will attempt to co-opt and redirect Trumpism, right? That's the natural tendency. Organizations and bureaucracies exist to perpetuate themselves, and the Borg will make every attempt to do that. So all the lobbyists and all those people who've just been hanging around DC for the last many decades will all start to sound Trumpy and try to blend in and get paid. That's the natural tendency. And so can Trump overcome that? Can he hire people who are true to that Ron Paul vision. I mean, that's a stretch, but at least he says he's going to give it a try. And imagine what Kamala would be saying right now. She would be saying, well, we're going to go full steam ahead with the Green New Deal or whatever. Or we're going to have some gigantic multi-trillion-dollar jobs program, or we are going to have DEI at all levels of government mandated. You're going to have, like California's law, you're going to have a certain number of women on the board of every public company and all this stuff. I mean, it would be full steam ahead with the agenda that we know leads to not only bankruptcy and default, but it leads to cities with crack addicts lying around amongst poop and needles. So, I mean, let's just be thankful we dodged that bullet and let's roll up our sleeves and do what we can do here.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Actually, I don't know if you were paying attention to this, but there were some notable, because we've been talking about California, and this is where I think there may be some credence to the idea that there is like a vibe shift going down, if you will. Yeah, I noticed that for example, like some of the George Soros funded district attorneys, George Gascon and Los Angeles County, were actually successfully recalled. And I think as well, the California voters passed a ballot proposition to take a much more tough on crime approach to like the shoplifting and other activities that were basically like state sanctioned by the state over the last decade because of this like decarceration, soft on crime agenda. Yeah. And also in Seattle, they've also taken a stronger approach now to cracking down on shoplifting. Do you believe that the soft on crime aspect of wokeism is getting rolled back, or is this a temporary blip?
No, I think it's for real. I mean, let's face it, California has a lot of wealthy people, and at some point they can't escape the vicissitudes of this unless they move. So I think it's real. I think it's a real backlash out there. Obviously, they sent the Adam Schiff, or what the hell his name is, to the Senate, which is incredible. But nonetheless, my family is still all out there for the most part. And I think it's real. The pushback's real. London Breed's no longer mayor of San Francisco. Yep. A positive as well. My wife and I lived in San Francisco for many years. So it's almost, when we visit, it's almost just like a different place. It's like a Stephen King movie version of San Francisco or something to us. And so that's positive. And let's face it, I still haven't seen the total popular vote numbers yet, but I suspect Trump got more votes in California this time than last. And he got a lot of votes in a lot of big blue states where you think, well, why would anyone bother to vote? And in, let's say, New York State or someplace where Kamala was sure to win the electoral college. Well, I think that's wise. People knew that the popular vote was something that the left keeps hammering and that it was important. And so Trump shut him up on that. And so I think soft on crime doesn't work. And I think the broken window theory of policing, libertarians hate it. I think it's true, though.
Yes, it's true.
I mean, Rudy Giuliani talks about when he became mayor, he had read some paper. I believe it was it was definitely Ivy League, but I believe it was a Harvard academic who laid all this out. And Rudy's police force took a lot of cues from that. And I know that there's nostalgia for the old New York where things were gritty and Times Square was full of prostitutes or whatever. But a lot of people were quite happy when Rudy cleaned up that city. And of course, now it's gone and turned the other way again. And so crime is another huge libertarian blind spot. And I read an article recently, which was hilarious. You talk about the 80-20 rule on steroids. Basically, Atlanta, which is a big majority black city, which is great. The police had identified some tiny number. It was something like 400 individuals, hardcore, violent, nasty, recidivist criminals. Something like 400 people, men, were responsible for some huge amount of the criminal activity in Atlanta. If you just did what Bukele's doing in El Salvador, and you took those 400 and said, okay, you're all in prison for life. That's it. Supermax, goodbye. You would vastly improve life for 99% of normal, ordinary Atlantans tomorrow, black, white, and otherwise. But this idea that you can't do that is just kind of interesting. And so, yeah, there's no liberty without order. And when you've got criminals roaming the streets and when you've got crack addicts and you had this absurd Walter Block notion of the commons, that it's okay for a bunch of junkies to just occupy the once heart-achingly beautiful city of Seattle, the beautiful city of Portland, Oregon, ruined by these homeless encampments and these junkies. Jose, what kind of society permits that? And is that liberty? No, it is not liberty. They need to be physically removed.
Oh yeah, like flogged with bamboo sticks. Like they need to get some East Asian style discipline, like bring back corporal punishment that works. We got Lee Kuan Yew and whatnot as like a model for that. But yeah, actually, I do not identify at all like as a libertarian these days. But yeah, there's a lot of blind spots that you mentioned there about how if you want like an orderly society where paradoxically the stuff that you extol, like private property, commerce, and all that, there has to be an underlying order to it. There's just no question. And it might be ugly, especially if you live in a multicultural state. Because here's like the newsflash that a lot of people don't get. Anybody that's praising places like Qatar, UAE, like Singapore or whatever, that have like, that are pretty diverse, and to a less extent, Malaysia. Those places, there's an underlying authoritarianism there that keeps those places orderly, because when you let people operate under a purely classical liberal framework that's permissive, it gets tribal and it gets pretty nasty to the point where you might actually have like a civil war break out. Just look at places like Lebanon, Syria, multi-ethnic, multi-confessional places, or any country in Africa for that matter that has a ton of ethnicities within like its polity. And yeah, I think that the past 10 years, I've enjoyed it, even though, yeah, it's been kind of a wild ride and disappointing in certain respects. I've enjoyed it though, because it's forced a lot of people to question their priors, their assumptions, and a lot of their ideological premises that were just pie in the sky, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Trump has been a challenge, I think, to everybody. Trumpism, Brexit. There's been a lot of populist movements across the right. We now see in democratic Germany, the parliament is looking to ban AfD from the ballots, the Alternative for Deutschland Party. I mean, things are getting interesting when you've got Matt Gaetz being nominated as Attorney General.
Yeah.
If for nothing else, Jose, politics is no longer boring.
Oh no, it's absolutely not. And we are going to see some big tensions for sure break out, because what I've noticed like over the years, you've had a knack of pointing out like the entitlement situation, especially in the US. Do you think that there's any credible political force that's going to try to manage this? Because I think that's just like, it could be like that's about to like unfold, and there's no telling what type of economic reversal it's going to cause for like the US.
Well, the demographics are very bad. The over 65 segment of the U.S. population is set to double by 2050. So that means there'll be even fewer young people paying into the rotten Social Security system for all these old people. Plus, if the economy stays reasonably together, medical advances, technology, pharmaceuticals continue to develop, you're going to have lots of people going into their 90s. Maybe even beyond. So that means that the healthcare costs continue to increase. And let's not forget, people used to kick off in their 60s oftentimes. Certainly when Social Security was created in 1935, life expectancy was something like 62 years old. So these entitlement programs are totally unsustainable. They have to be phased out. There's no doubt about it. And the demographics are going the wrong way. And I think that's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the worse things get, the more young people will fail to get out there and form big families and buy houses and all that, because it just won't be possible. And so we're going to be hitting young people with these taxes, payroll taxes, to pay for old people who are relatively far wealthier. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So I don't know how you solve that. I mean, we know how to solve it mathematically, but it's politically, how do you solve it?
Oh yeah. That's the third rail. Yeah. So you don't touch it. And yeah, do you foresee, because of the polarization in the US, do you foresee a eventual breakdown of the entire federal government and the emergence of separatist movements? Because I just think that when you look at an empire that's so overstretched, both domestically and internationally, all it takes is like one embarrassing military reversal abroad, or some, say, like a stagflationary collapse in the US, or a combination of both, to be honest, to like just knock the system out, where people just say like, screw it, we give up, we don't have faith in the system anymore. And people just retrench and start going back to like a more tribalistic form of governance. Do you see that taking place?
Yeah, I think the eventual breakup of the United States is inevitable. There's no doubt about it. And I think people will vote with their feet and flock to more economically productive areas by necessity. I mean, when you talk about government, you're really talking about a fiction. You're talking about faith. And so it's one thing when you say our government is incapable of projecting power across the globe and preventing, let's say, China from invading Taiwan, or preventing China from insisting that Taiwan is not independent. That's a form of government failure that Americans might look at and say, gee whiz. But when it comes down to your city and there's junkies in the park and your kid has to walk past them on their way to school, well, that's the kind of government failure that hits a lot closer to home, and that's going to lead people to say, well, what is this thing I'm paying? What is this thing that I'm giving respect to that can't even perform its most basic functions of public safety, peace, security, property rights, contract enforcement, that sort of thing? When you start to have basically failed states within the U.S., that's, I think, when you're going to have this natural regional type breakup. And you can almost see California, for example, becoming a big sort of a Brazil.
Yes.
With a wealthy coastal upper class that lives pretty well and beautiful weather and beautiful scenery and all that. And then sort of the big, hotter inland part of the state inhabited by almost shanty towns or favelas, or however you want to see it. I mean, you could see a cold weather version of that in a state like Pennsylvania, where you had some cities and then you had people with cars up on blocks out in the middle of the state. So it really is all about the economics. For the time being, America still works better than the rest of the world. You turn on the tap, you got hot and cold running water, you flip the switch, the lights come on, you go to the gas station, there's gas, you go online, your bank works. I mean, all that stuff works. And it's when it starts to not work that secession and breakaway movements won't seem so crazy anymore.
Yep, it remains to be seen. That is going to be one thing to look out for. But yeah, before we depart, do you have any like hot takes or predictions for the near future that you'd like to leave my audience with?
Well, I think as we record this, Tulsi Gabbard and Matt Gaetz have just been nominated to the intelligence officer and attorney general, respectively. I think that at least one, if not two or three of Trump's picks will get pushback from the Senate. I think he knows that, and that there's a fallback position. In other words, maybe Matt Gaetz just becomes Florida senator when Marco Rubio, who's a swamp creature, actually does get approved by the Senate. And then you end up with a really Trumpian ally in the Senate in the form of Matt Gaetz. So that's the kind of thing that I could see happening. I could definitely see either Tulsi or this Hegsmith guy. What's his name?
Yeah, Hegsmith. Yeah.
He's just like a Fox and Friends TV guy who was in the military. I could see him or Tulsi possibly getting challenged in the process. Remember, you only need 4 senators to go sideways. And then finally, of course, is the RFK Jr. being nominated the head of HHS. That pharma is one of the most powerful forces in American society. It's the single big advertising revenue dollar in all of media. So it controls things like the NFL went through its advertising dollars. So I could see like a real spectacle, like a really nasty fight behind the scenes and then openly in the Senate nomination process for RFK Jr. I mean, that would be something, but it is all happening so fast. It's all going to be at the very beginning of Trump's term. And let's hope and pray that he learns something from that first time around, and the Ivankas and the Jareds are far away, and there's no Boltons in the cabinet, and that people like Steve Bannon are actually listened to.
Yeah, definitely stuff to watch, and hopefully Trump has learned his lesson. But nevertheless, I'm going to enjoy this entire show because it's just one of the next acts in the play of the decline of the globalist American empire. But anyways, Jeff, where can my listeners keep up with your latest work?
The best way is just to find me on Twitter at Jeff Deist, where I'm pretty active.
Awesome. Well, to my audience, thank you again for your attention. And with that, El Nino has spoken.